In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and endless fields, there stood an auto repair shop that buzzed with activity every day. The shop wasn't anything fancy. It had a faded sign hanging above the entrance, chipped paint on the walls, and oil stains scattered across the concrete floor. But it was the kind of place where people came not just for car repairs, but also for stories, laughter, and camaraderie. Inside this lively garage worked Eli Thompson, a man who kept to himself and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Eli was the janitor. His job was simple: sweep the floors, clean up tools after the mechanics were done using them, wipe down workbenches, and make sure the shop looked presentable at the end of each day. He wore old, worn-out overalls that smelled faintly of grease and carried a mop like it was his most trusted companion. To everyone else in the shop, he was invisible, a background figure whose presence went unnoticed until someone needed him to clear away metal shavings or fetch a broom. The mechanics, a rowdy bunch of men and women who loved cracking jokes and teasing each other, often used Eli as the butt of their humor. They called him the Shadow because he moved silently through the shop, always appearing when least expected. Sometimes they'd toss crumpled soda cans onto the floor just to see if he'd pick them up without saying a word, and he did, every single time. No complaints, no arguments, just quiet obedience. It wasn't that Eli didn't hear their jokes or notice their teasing. He simply chose not to engage. He preferred solitude, finding comfort in the rhythmic swish of his mop and the hum of engines being repaired around him. Despite his reserved nature, Eli had been working at the shop for nearly 10 years. Over those years, he'd seen countless cars come and go, some barely sputtering into the garage, others gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He knew the sound of a misfiring engine, the smell of burnt oil, and the way sparks flew when a welder touched metal. Yet no one ever asked him what he thought about these things. No one ever considered that maybe, just maybe, Eli understood more than he let on. One particularly chaotic afternoon, the shop received a visitor unlike any other. A sleek silver luxury car glided into the driveway, its tires whispering against the asphalt. The driver stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit, and approached the counter with an air of authority. The car belonged to Mr. Harrington, a wealthy businessman known for owning only the finest vehicles. Everyone in the shop stopped what they were doing to admire the machine. Its curves were flawless, its chrome accents gleamed, and its engine purred softly beneath the hood. But there was a problem. Mr. Harrington explained that the car had started making strange noises during his morning commute. At first, it was a faint knocking sound, almost imperceptible. Then, as the day wore on, the noise grew louder, accompanied by occasional jerks and stutters. By the time he arrived at the shop, the once smooth ride felt like driving over gravel. The mechanics gathered around the car, peering under the hood with furrowed brows. What they found baffled even the most seasoned among them. The engine was a marvel of modern engineering, a complex piece of machinery designed with precision and packed with cutting-edge technology. It featured turbochargers, variable valve timing systems, and sensors that monitored everything from fuel injection to exhaust emissions. For the average mechanic, fixing such an engine would be challenging enough. But this particular model had a reputation for being notoriously difficult to diagnose. Hours passed as the team pored over manuals, ran diagnostic tests, and debated possible solutions. Tools clanged against metal, curses filled the air, and coffee cups piled up on the workbench. Still, the problem eluded them. Frustration mounted, tempers flared, and the atmosphere in the shop turned tense. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, one of the younger mechanics, Jake, decided to lighten the mood with a joke. "Hey, why don't we let Eli take a shot at it?" Jake said, grinning ear to ear. The room fell silent for a moment before erupting into laughter. The idea was absurd. Eli, the janitor who never said more than 2 words at a time, fixing a multi-million-dollar engine? It was laughable, ridiculous, and utterly impossible. Or so they thought. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of ignoring the comment or walking away, Eli paused mid-sweep and looked up. His dark eyes met Jake's, steady and unwavering. For the first time in years, the janitor spoke. "You really want me to try?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The laughter died down instantly, replaced by stunned silence. No one had anticipated that Eli would actually respond, let alone agree to the dare. The mechanics exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to encourage him or tell him to stick to mopping floors. Finally, the shop owner shrugged and gestured toward the car. "Go ahead, Eli," he said with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "What do we have to lose?" With that, Eli set aside his mop and walked over to the car. The entire shop watched as he rolled up his sleeves, pulled on a pair of gloves, and leaned over the open hood. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, deliberately, Eli began inspecting the engine. He traced his fingers along hoses, tapped lightly on components, and listened intently to the faint sounds coming from beneath the metal. The room was so quiet you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. No one dared to interrupt him, not because they believed he could fix the problem, but because they couldn't look away. There was something mesmerizing about the way Eli moved, confident, purposeful, and completely at ease. It was as though he'd done this 1,000 times before. And deep down, despite their skepticism, a tiny spark of curiosity flickered in the minds of everyone watching. Could it be possible that the janitor hiding in plain sight held secrets none of them had ever imagined? As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew thicker. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change the shop, and Eli, forever. As Eli leaned over the gleaming silver car, the mechanics gathered around him, their earlier amusement fading into stunned silence. They had expected Eli to fumble, to hesitate, or perhaps even back out of the dare altogether. But what they saw instead was something entirely different. Eli's movements were precise and deliberate, his hands steady as he examined the labyrinth of wires, hoses, and components under the hood. He didn't rush. He took his time, inspecting every inch of the engine with a level of focus that bordered on reverence. The shop owner, Mr. Carter, crossed his arms and tilted his head, studying Eli curiously. "You sure you know what you're doing?" he asked cautiously, half expecting Eli to admit it was all a joke and step aside. But Eli didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for a flashlight from the nearby workbench and shone it into the depths of the engine bay. He muttered something under his breath, words like valve timing and pressure sensor, that made the mechanics exchange puzzled glances. These weren't phrases someone unfamiliar with cars would casually throw around. Jake, the young mechanic who had initially teased Eli, scratched his head. "Wait a second," he said, leaning closer. "Did he just say variable valve lift? That's not exactly beginner stuff." Another mechanic, Sarah, nodded slowly. "Yeah, and did you hear him mention camshaft alignment? That's advanced level talk. How does he even know that?" Eli continued working, oblivious to the growing murmurs behind him. He pressed a stethoscope-like tool against different parts of the engine, listening intently for irregularities. After a few moments, he straightened up and turned to face the group. His expression was calm but serious, and for the first time, no one laughed or cracked a joke at his expense. "I think I know what's wrong," Eli said simply. The room went silent again. Even Mr. Harrington, who had been pacing nervously near the counter, stopped mid-step and stared at the janitor in disbelief. "Well?" Mr. Carter prompted, his voice tinged with both skepticism and curiosity. "What is it?" Eli gestured toward the engine. "It's the timing chain," he explained. "It's stretched slightly, which is causing misalignment between the crankshaft and the camshaft. That's why you're hearing the knocking sound. It's the pistons hitting the valves. If we don't fix it soon, it'll cause major damage." The mechanics exchanged wide-eyed looks. Timing chains were notoriously tricky to diagnose, especially in high-end engines like this one. Most of them hadn't even considered it as a possibility, because diagnosing such issues required specialized knowledge and patience. Yet here was Eli, explaining it as if it were second nature. Sarah stepped forward, her brow furrowed. "How do you know all this?" she asked bluntly. "I mean, you're the janitor." For a moment, Eli hesitated. He glanced down at his oil-streaked gloves, then back at the group, It was clear he hadn't planned on sharing this part of himself, but the weight of their stares left him little choice. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "Before I came here," Eli started, his voice softer now, "I used to design engines. Not just any engines, high-performance ones. I worked for some of the biggest names in the industry. My team and I developed systems that ended up in race cars, luxury vehicles, and even experimental prototypes. The room was so quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. No one dared interrupt as Eli continued. But something happened. He admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. There was an accident, a prototype malfunctioned during testing. People got hurt. Good people. Talented drivers who trusted me. After that, I couldn't stay in the industry anymore. I needed to get away, to start over somewhere where no one knew my name or my past." He paused, swallowing hard. "So I came here." Sweeping floors seemed like a good way to disappear. No one spoke for several seconds. The revelation hung heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of motor oil and rubber. Slowly, Jake broke the silence. "Wait, you're telling us you're like some kind of genius engineer? And you've been cleaning toilets this whole time?" Eli gave a small, rueful smile. "I didn't come here to be a hero. I came to forget, to leave all that behind me. Sometimes life doesn't give you a second chance to make things right. Or so I thought." Mr. Carter rubbed his temples, clearly trying to process everything. "Why didn't you say something sooner? We could have used your expertise. And risk dragging my past back into the light?" Eli replied evenly. "I didn't want that. This job, it's simple, predictable, safe. Until today, anyway." The group fell silent again, this time out of respect rather than shock. They realized, now that Eli wasn't just a janitor, he was a man carrying scars from a life he'd tried desperately to escape. And yet, despite his efforts to remain invisible, fate had brought him back to the very world he'd fled. Determined to prove himself once more, Eli returned his attention to the car. Using tools borrowed from the workbench, he carefully disassembled, parts of the engine explaining each step as he went along. "See this bolt here?" he said, pointing to a tiny component. "If you tighten it too much, it can warp the housing. That's why precision is key." The mechanics listened intently, hanging on his every word. For years, they'd relied on manuals and online tutorials to guide them through tough repairs. Now they were learning from someone who had literally written the book on engine design. Hours passed, and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the shop floor. By the time Eli tightened the final bolt and reconnected the last wire, the entire team had gathered around the car, holding their collective breath. With a nod, Eli turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, smooth and powerful, free of the knocking sounds that had plagued it earlier. Everyone erupted into applause, clapping and cheering as though they'd witnessed a miracle. Mr. Harrington, who had been watching anxiously from the sidelines, let out a relieved laugh. "Unbelievable," he exclaimed, shaking Eli's hand vigorously. "You saved my car, and probably saved me thousands in replacement costs. Thank you." Eli accepted the praise graciously but modestly. "Just doing my job," he said with a shrug, though there was a hint of pride in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of the passion that had once driven him to create and innovate. As the celebration died down, and Mr. Harrington drove off into the night, the shop owner turned to Eli. "Listen," he said, his tone serious but kind. "We need you here, not as a janitor, but as part of the team. You've got skills none of us can match. Will you consider staying on as a mechanic?" Eli hesitated, torn between the safety of his old routine and the opportunity to embrace his true calling. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "but on one condition. I keep my broom. Some habits are hard to break." The room erupted into laughter, and for the first time in years, Eli allowed himself to feel a sense of belonging. Little did he know, this decision would set off a chain of events that would transform not only the shop, but also his own life in ways he never imagined. The next morning, the auto shop buzzed with a newfound energy. Word of Eli's incredible feat had spread like wildfire among the staff, and the atmosphere was electric. Mechanics who had once teased him now approached him with genuine curiosity and respect. Even customers waiting in the lobby couldn't help but notice the change. There was an air of excitement, almost reverence, surrounding the usually unassuming janitor-turned-mechanic. Eli, however, remained grounded. He arrived early as always, his mop in hand, sweeping up before diving into the day's work. But this time, instead of slipping quietly into the background, he found himself at the center of attention. The shop owner, Mr. Carter, wasted no time, assigning him to the most challenging cases that came through the door. Cars with mysterious rattles, engines that refused to start, and electrical systems that baffled even the veterans were all handed over to Eli without hesitation. At first, Eli hesitated to take on too much. He didn't want to step on anyone's toes or disrupt the natural flow of the shop. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that his presence was having a profound impact. Not just on the quality of repairs, but on the morale of the entire team. His calm demeanor and encyclopedic knowledge inspired confidence in everyone around him. Mechanics who had struggled with complex problems for hours began seeking his advice, and Eli never turned them away. Instead, he patiently walked them through solutions, breaking down complicated concepts into simple terms they could understand. One particular case stood out, a beat-up old truck brought in by a local farmer named Joe. The vehicle had been sputtering and stalling for months, and every mechanic in town had given up on it. When Joe rolled into the shop, his face was etched with worry. "This truck's my lifeline," he explained, running a calloused hand over the rusted hood. "If I can't get it fixed, I might lose the farm." The other mechanics exchanged uneasy glances. They'd already tried everything they knew, and none of their usual tricks had worked. Sensing their hesitation, Eli stepped forward. "Let me take a look," he said simply. Joe eyed him suspiciously. "You sure? This thing's been giving folks trouble for years." Eli nodded, unfazed. Over the course of 2 days, he dismantled nearly half the engine, meticulously inspecting each component. What he discovered shocked everyone. The problem wasn't mechanical at all, it was electrical. A corroded wire deep within the wiring harness had been causing intermittent shorts, leading to the erratic behavior. With a few careful adjustments and some creative rewiring, Eli brought the truck back to life. Joe's eyes welled with tears as he hugged Eli tightly, thanking him profusely. From that day on, Joe became one of the shop's most loyal customers, often stopping by just to chat and bring fresh produce from his farm. As word of Eli's talents continued to spread, the shop attracted increasingly difficult jobs. Luxury, sports cars, vintage classics, and even hybrid vehicles that required specialized knowledge started rolling in. Each repair added to Eli's reputation, not just as a skilled mechanic, but as someone who genuinely cared about solving problems. Unlike many others in the industry, Eli didn't rush through jobs or cut corners. He treated every car as if it were his own, taking the time to ensure it ran perfectly before handing it back to its owner. But it wasn't just the customers who noticed the difference. The mechanics themselves began to thrive under Eli's mentorship. Younger members of the team, like Jake and Sarah, soaked up his lessons eagerly. He taught them how to listen to an engine, not just with diagnostic tools, but with their ears and instincts. He showed them the importance of patience and precision, reminding them that even the smallest detail could make or break a repair. In turn, the team grew closer, working together more seamlessly than ever before. Despite his growing influence, Eli remained humble. He never sought recognition or praise, preferring to let his work speak for itself. Still, there were moments when the weight of his past crept back into his mind. Late at night, after the shop had closed and the others had gone home, he would sit alone in the dimly lit garage, staring at the rows of tools neatly arranged on the walls. Memories of the accident, the prototype failure that had shattered his career, would surface unbidden, leaving him restless and uneasy. One evening, Sarah found him sitting there, lost in thought. She hesitated for a moment before approaching cautiously. "Hey, Eli," she said softly. "Mind if I join you?" Eli looked up, startled but not unwelcoming. "Sure," he replied, gesturing to the stool beside him. Sarah sat down, studying him carefully. "I've been meaning to ask, why did you really leave the industry? I mean, you're so good at what you do, it doesn't make sense to walk away from something like that." Eli sighed, rubbing his temples. For a long time, he didn't answer. Then slowly, he began to speak. "It wasn't just the accident," he admitted. "It was the guilt. Knowing that my design, a system I'd poured my heart into, had failed so catastrophically. People trusted me, relied on me, and I let them down. I couldn't face it anymore. So I ran." Sarah listened intently, her expression softening. "But you didn't fail, Eli. You've been helping people here every single day. Look at Joe's truck or Mr. Harrington's car. Those aren't failures, they're victories. Doesn't that count for something?" Eli smiled faintly, though his eyes still held a trace of sadness. "Maybe," he said. "But it's hard to forget the past. Hard to forgive yourself." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Well, we're glad you're here now. You've changed this place for the better. And I think you're starting to change yourself too." Her words lingered in Eli's mind long after she left. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance. That perhaps the skills and passion he'd buried deep inside weren't meant to stay hidden forever. Over the following weeks, Eli threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. He tackled each challenge with determination, pushing himself to learn new techniques and adapt to modern technologies. At the same time, he opened up more to the team, sharing stories from his days as an engineer and offering insights that left them in awe. Slowly but surely, the walls he'd built around himself began to crumble. And then, one fateful afternoon, a customer walked into the shop carrying a battered briefcase. Inside was a set of blueprints for a custom-built race car engine, one designed specifically for speed and endurance. The client, a wealthy entrepreneur with dreams of entering the racing circuit, wanted the shop to build it from scratch. It was a monumental task, one that would require every ounce of expertise the team possessed. When the blueprints were laid out on the workbench, all eyes turned to Eli. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his fingers tracing the intricate lines on the paper. A slow smile spread across his face as he realized what this project represented. Not just a test of skill, but an opportunity to reclaim a piece of himself he'd thought lost forever. For the first time in years, Eli felt truly alive. The arrival of the custom race car engine project marked a turning point, not just for Eli but for the entire shop. The blueprints were breathtaking, pages filled with intricate designs, detailed schematics, and notes scrawled in precise handwriting. It was clear that this wasn't just any ordinary build, it was a masterpiece waiting to be brought to life. For Eli, the challenge stirred something deep within him, a spark of excitement he hadn't felt in years. At first, the team was hesitant. Building an engine from scratch, especially one designed for high-performance racing, was far beyond anything they'd ever attempted. The materials required were expensive, the tolerances razor-thin, and the margin for error non-existent. One wrong move could mean weeks of wasted effort and thousands of dollars down the drain. But Eli's confidence was unwavering. "We can do this," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the room's uncertainty. "Trust me." With those words, the shop transformed into a hive of activity. Eli took charge, dividing the team into smaller groups, each responsible for specific components of the engine. He assigned Jake to work on the pistons, Sarah to handle the fuel injection system, and another mechanic, Tony, to focus on the exhaust manifold. Every evening, they gathered around the workbench to review progress, troubleshoot problems, and share ideas. Under Eli's guidance, the process became collaborative, almost magical. What had once seemed impossible began to take shape before their eyes. Eli worked tirelessly, often staying late into the night to ensure every detail met his exacting standards. His hands moved with precision as he machined parts, welded joints, and tested connections. He taught the team techniques they'd never seen before, like balancing crankshafts to fractions of a millimeter or aligning camshafts with pinpoint accuracy. To the others, it felt like watching an artist at work, someone who didn't just understand machines but seemed to communicate with them on a deeper level. As the weeks passed, the shop buzzed with anticipation. Customers visiting for routine repairs couldn't help but notice the growing structure on the central workbench, a gleaming assembly of chrome, steel, and carbon fiber. Word spread quickly through town about the super engine being built at Carter's auto shop, drawing curious visitors and even local reporters. For the first time, the shop wasn't just known for fixing cars. It was becoming a hub of innovation and craftsmanship, but the project wasn't without its challenges. Midway through construction, disaster struck when a critical component, the turbocharger housing, arrived damaged. The supplier wouldn't be able to send a replacement for weeks, potentially derailing the entire timeline. Frustration rippled through the team, but Eli remained calm. "We'll fix it ourselves," he declared, rolling up his sleeves. Using scrap metal and a lathe, he crafted a replacement piece by hand, working late into the night until it fit perfectly. When the team saw what he'd done, their admiration for him grew even stronger. Through it all, Eli continued to open up about his past. During breaks, he shared stories of his days as an engineer, how he'd helped develop cutting-edge technologies, traveled to international conferences, and collaborated with some of the brightest minds in the industry. He spoke candidly about the accident that had derailed his career, describing the guilt and shame that had haunted him for years. His honesty resonated deeply with the team, fostering a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. They weren't just co-workers anymore. They were a family, united by a shared goal and a growing belief in Eli's vision. By the time the engine was complete, it was nothing short of a marvel. Sleek and powerful, it roared to life during its first test run, sending vibrations through the shop floor that left everyone grinning ear to ear. The client, overwhelmed with gratitude, insisted on naming the engine the Eli Special, much to Eli's embarrassment. News of the achievement spread rapidly, attracting attention from far beyond the small town. Racing enthusiasts, engineers, and even representatives from major automotive companies began reaching out, eager to learn more about the shop and the man behind the project. For Eli, the success of the engine represented more than just professional redemption. It was personal healing. Each bolt tightened, each weld completed, felt like a step toward forgiving himself for the mistakes of his past. With the support of his colleagues, he began to see that failure wasn't the end, but rather a chance to grow and rebuild. The guilt that had weighed him down for so long started to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Recognizing Eli's transformative impact on the shop, Mr. Carter made a bold decision. He officially promoted Eli to head mechanic, giving him full creative control over future projects. At first, Eli hesitated, worried about stepping too far into the spotlight. But the encouragement of his teammates convinced him to accept. "You've earned this," Sarah told him one evening, her tone firm but kind. "Don't let fear hold you back, not again." In his new role, Eli didn't just focus on repairs and builds. He also prioritized teaching. He implemented weekly training sessions where he walked the team through advanced techniques, encouraged them to experiment with new ideas, and pushed them to think outside the box. Under his leadership, the shop evolved into a center of excellence, attracting talented mechanics from neighboring towns who wanted to learn from the legendary janitor turned genius. The changes weren't limited to the shop itself. Eli's influence extended to the community as well. Inspired by his story, local schools invited him to speak to students about perseverance, resilience, and the importance of following one's passions. Parents brought their children to the shop on weekends, hoping to ignite an interest in engineering and mechanics. Even Joe, the farmer whose truck Eli had saved, stopped by regularly with fresh produce and stories of how the shop had inspired his grandson to pursue a career in automotive design. Despite the accolades and recognition, Eli remained humble. He still picked up his mop at the end of each day, sweeping floors and tidying tools as if nothing had changed. To him, The act of cleaning wasn't just about maintaining order. It was a reminder of where he'd come from and how far he'd come. And though he no longer hid in the shadows, he carried with him the lessons of his past. That greatness could emerge from unexpected places, and that second chances were worth fighting for. As the shop prepared for its next big project, a restoration of a vintage muscle car, Eli stood at the center of it all, quietly guiding, teaching, and inspiring. He had found not only his place in the world, but also a way to give back to those who had welcomed him with open arms. Little did he know, however, that his journey was far from over. The legacy he was building would soon reach heights he could scarcely imagine, touching lives far beyond the walls of the garage. As the months rolled by, Eli's influence continued to ripple outward, transforming not only the auto shop but also the lives of everyone around him. The success of the Eli Special had opened doors that no one could have anticipated. Racing teams from across the country began reaching out, eager to collaborate with the small-town garage that had produced such an extraordinary engine. Corporate executives flew in for meetings, offering lucrative contracts and partnerships. Even automotive magazines featured glowing profiles of Carter's auto shop, dubbing it a hidden gem of innovation. But amidst all the attention and opportunities, Eli remained steadfastly grounded. He turned down offers to move to bigger cities or join prestigious firms, choosing instead to stay rooted in the community that had embraced him. "This is where I belong," he told Mr. Carter one evening as they sat together in the quiet shop, after hours. "I've found my purpose here." That purpose extended far beyond fixing cars. Eli became a mentor not just to his colleagues but to anyone who crossed his path. Local high school students interested in engineering flocked to the shop after school, eager to learn from the man whose story had captured their imaginations. Parents thanked Eli for inspiring their children to dream bigger and aim higher. One boy, Timmy, whose family struggled financially, spent every free moment shadowing Eli. By the end of the year, Timmy had built his own miniature go-kart, a project Eli had guided him through step by step. Seeing the pride on Timmy's face when the little vehicle roared to life was one of Eli's proudest moments. Eli also used his platform to give back to the community. He organized weekend workshops where people could bring in broken appliances, bicycles or toys, and he'd teach them how to repair them themselves. These sessions weren't just about saving money. They were about empowering people to take control of their lives, however small the task might seem. For many, these workshops became a lifeline, a way to connect with others and rediscover their own potential. Despite his growing fame, Eli never forgot the guilt that had driven him into hiding years ago. Late at night, when the shop was empty, and the hum of engines faded into silence, memories of the accident still surfaced. He saw the faces of the test drivers who had been injured, their trust shattered, their careers derailed. Though he had come a long way in forgiving himself, those wounds ran deep, and healing took time. One evening, during one of his solitary moments in the shop, Sarah approached him. She carried 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Eli before sitting beside him. "You okay?" she asked gently. It wasn't the first time she'd checked in on him, but tonight, her tone suggested she wanted more than a polite answer. Eli sighed, staring into the dark liquid swirling in his cup. "I keep thinking about them," he admitted. "The drivers. What happened? It was my fault." Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, it wasn't. You didn't mean for any of that to happen. Accidents aren't failures, they're lessons. Look at everything you've done since then. You've helped so many people, Eli. You've made this place better, stronger. Doesn't that count?" Her words lingered in the air, sinking into Eli's heart like rain on parched soil. Over the next few weeks, he began reaching out to some of the individuals affected by the accident. It wasn't easy, writing emails, making phone calls, confronting ghosts he'd avoided for years. But it was necessary. To his surprise, most of the former test drivers welcomed his apology with grace and understanding. Many had moved on with their lives, finding new passions and purposes despite their injuries. One of them, a woman named Rachel, even invited Eli to visit her art studio, where she now created breathtaking sculptures inspired by her experiences. Meeting Rachel changed something in Eli. Her resilience reminded him that life wasn't defined by mistakes, but by how we responded to them. As they talked, surrounded by vibrant paintings and intricate metalwork, Eli realized he had already begun rebuilding, not just engines, but himself. The weight he'd carried for so long finally started to lift, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't felt in decades. Back at the shop, Eli poured this newfound clarity into his work. Under his leadership, the team tackled increasingly ambitious projects, restoring classic cars to showroom condition, designing custom parts for off-road vehicles, and even collaborating with local inventors on eco-friendly prototypes. Each success reinforced the shop's reputation as a beacon of creativity and expertise. Customers traveled from neighboring states just to experience the magic happening inside its walls. Eli also spearheaded initiatives to make the shop more inclusive. Recognizing the lack of diversity in the automotive industry, he partnered with local organizations to offer scholarships and apprenticeships to underrepresented groups. Young women, veterans, and individuals from low-income backgrounds found a welcoming space where they could learn valuable skills and build confidence. Watching these newcomers thrive filled Eli with a joy he hadn't known was possible. Meanwhile, the bond between Eli and his team grew stronger than ever. They celebrated milestones together, birthdays, anniversaries, promotions, and supported each other through tough times. When Jake's father fell ill, the entire staff rallied to help, cover his shifts while he cared for his family. When Sarah decided to pursue further education in mechanical engineering, Eli personally wrote her recommendation letter and cheered her on every step of the way. In return, they stood by him, reminding him daily of his worth and the impact he'd had on their lives. As the seasons changed, so did the town itself. What had once been a sleepy, overlooked community blossomed into a hub of innovation and collaboration. Businesses thrived, schools flourished, and residents took pride in being part of something special. At the center of it all was Eli, a man who had once sought anonymity but had become a symbol of hope, perseverance, and redemption. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled outside the shop windows, Eli stood at the workbench, reviewing blueprints for a new project. He glanced up to see Mr. Carter walking toward him, a broad smile on his face. "Got a minute?" the shop owner asked. "Always," Eli replied, setting down the plans. Mr. Carter pulled out a folded newspaper and handed it to Eli. On the front page was an article titled, "From Janitor to Legend, How One Man Transformed." A small-town garage. Beneath the headline was a photo of Eli standing beside the gleaming race car engine, surrounded by his smiling team. Eli chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't know about legend," he said modestly. Mr. Carter clapped him on the shoulder. "You might not see it, but the rest of us do. You've changed this place and us forever." For a moment, Eli simply stood there, absorbing the weight of those words. Then, with a quiet smile, he turned back to the blueprints. There was still work to be done, challenges to overcome, and dreams to chase. But for the first time in his life, Eli felt truly at peace, with his past, his present, and the limitless possibilities of the future. Little did he know, the best chapter of his story was yet to come. Years passed, and Carter's auto shop became more than just a place to fix cars. It evolved into a cornerstone of the community. Eli, now in his late 50s, had earned a reputation that stretched far beyond the small town. His name was synonymous with excellence, creativity, and kindness. Yet despite the accolades and admiration, he remained the same humble man who had once swept floors in silence. Every morning he arrived at the shop before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, and greeted his team with a warm smile. And every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he stayed behind to tidy up, ensuring the workspace was ready for the next day. But change was inevitable. As time went on, Eli began to feel the weight of age settling into his bones. The long hours bent over engines, The constant problem-solving and the physical demands of the job started to take their toll. Though he still moved with purpose, there were days when his hands trembled slightly or his back ached after standing too long. It wasn't something he complained about. Eli never complained. But his colleagues noticed. They saw the way he sometimes paused mid-task to catch his breath, the faint lines of fatigue etched deeper into his face. One spring afternoon, Mr. Carter called a meeting in the shop's break room. The entire team gathered around the scarred wooden table, curious about what the boss wanted to discuss. When everyone was seated, Mr. Carter cleared his throat and turned to Eli. "We've been talking," he began, glancing around the room for support, "and we think it's time you slowed down a bit." Eli raised an eyebrow, amused but skeptical. "Slowed down? You know I don't do slowed down." Mr. Carter chuckled. "Not retirement. We're not letting you off that easy. But maybe less hands-on work, more mentoring? We can't. Lose your knowledge, Eli, not yet." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Jake chimed in. "Yeah, teach us everything you know while you still have the patience for it," Sarah added, "and write some of it down this time. Your brain is basically a treasure chest." Eli laughed softly, touched by their concern. He knew they were right. The torch needed to be passed eventually. Still, the idea of stepping back from the work he loved so deeply filled him with a pang of sadness. Yet as he looked around the table at the faces of his friends and protégés, he realized something. His legacy wasn't just in the engines he built or the repairs he made. It was in the people he had inspired. Over the next few months, Eli transitioned into a new role. While he still oversaw major projects and offered guidance on complex repairs, he spent more time teaching and documenting his methods. He created detailed manuals filled with diagrams, tips, and step-by-step instructions, ensuring that his expertise wouldn't vanish when he finally hung up his wrenches for good. On weekends, he hosted larger workshops open to anyone interested in learning, not just mechanics, but hobbyists, students, and curious minds of all ages. Word of these workshops spread quickly, drawing participants from across the country. Families brought their kids, retirees came to rediscover old skills, and aspiring engineers sought advice from the master himself. One young woman named Mia, a college student studying mechanical engineering, traveled hundreds of miles to attend. She stayed after one session to thank Eli personally. "You've changed my life," she said earnestly. "I didn't think I could make it in this field, but hearing your story, it gave me hope." Hearing those words, Eli felt a warmth in his chest that no amount of praise or recognition could match. This was why he had stayed. This was his true purpose. As the years rolled on, Eli gradually stepped further away from the day-to-day operations of the shop. By the time he reached his 60th birthday, he officially retired from active duty, though no one dared call it retirement. Instead, they referred to it as Phase 2 of Eli's journey. He continued mentoring, writing, and speaking at events, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. His book, titled From the Shadows, A Mechanic's Journey, became a bestseller, inspiring countless readers to pursue their passions despite setbacks. On the day of his official farewell party, the entire town turned out to celebrate. The shop was decorated with banners and balloons, and a long table groaned under the weight of homemade dishes brought by grateful customers and friends. Mechanics past and present stood shoulder to shoulder, raising glasses in Eli's honor. Even Timmy, the boy who had built the go-kart, returned as a confident teenager eager to show off his latest project, a fully functional electric bike designed with Eli's guidance. When it was Eli's turn to speak, he took the microphone with a shy smile. For a moment, he simply looked out at the sea of familiar faces, his eyes glistening with emotion. Then, in his quiet, steady voice, he began to talk. "I never expected any of this," he admitted, gesturing to the crowd. "When I first came here, I thought I'd found a place to disappear, a place where no one would ask questions or expect anything from me. What I got instead was a family. You taught me that second chances aren't just possible. They're worth fighting for." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. "People often ask me how I did it, how I went from being a janitor to whatever this is. The truth is, I didn't do it alone. None of us succeed alone. It takes support, trust, and a willingness to keep going, even when things seem impossible. So if there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this. Don't let fear stop you. Don't let failure define you. Keep building, keep fixing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the shop and spilling out into the street. As Eli stepped down from the makeshift stage, he was surrounded by hugs, handshakes, and heartfelt thanks. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to fully embrace the love and gratitude of those around him. In the years that followed, Eli's influence only grew. His workshops expanded into online courses, reaching aspiring mechanics and engineers worldwide. Schools adopted his teachings, incorporating his methods into their curriculums, and in the small town where it all began, Carter's Auto Shop remained a beacon of innovation and community spirit, a living testament to the man who had transformed it. Though Eli eventually slowed down even further, spending his days tinkering. In a small garage behind his home, his legacy endured. Visitors still stopped by the shop to share stories of how he had impacted their lives. Parents told their children about the janitor who fixed the unsolvable engine problem. Students quoted passages from his book in essays and speeches, and mechanics everywhere carried a piece of Eli's wisdom with them, whether they realized it or not. One crisp winter morning, as snow blanketed the quiet streets of the town, Eli sat in his favorite chair by the window sipping a cup of coffee. Outside, the world was hushed, peaceful. Inside, the walls of his home were lined with photographs, awards, and mementos from a lifetime of hard work and heart. But what brought him the greatest joy wasn't the trophies or titles. It was knowing that he had made a difference. That, in his own quiet way, he had helped build something lasting. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the room, Eli closed his eyes and smiled. He had started as a shadow, unseen and unheard. But in the end, he had become a light, a guiding force for others to follow. And that, he thought, was a life well lived.